Hello, I'm Zara Batstra, and welcome to the Eternal Cavern, and welcome to the Eternal Cavern, and welcome to the Eternal Cavern, and welcome to the Eternal Cavern. Oh, sorry about that. There's a bit of an echo in here. Anyway, so I read some books this year. I'm going to highlight the ones that stood out above or below the rest. I'm going to start with the ones I really didn't care for and move on to the best books in certain aspects. There's fiction and nonfiction mixed throughout this list, and all the books are pretty unique, so I can't rank them in order. But the last book that I'll talk about is the best book of the year that I read. So stay tuned. Watch to the end to find out what my very best book of the year is. So let's start with the most disappointing book. This book got a lot of hype last year. Everyone had it on their best of the year lists in 2024. That book is James by Percival Everett. I usually shy away from books that everyone likes because I tend to be disappointed. James, I heard, did something with language that another book that I read did with language. I wanted to compare how the two books handled that plot device. I picked up James after I read William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner. Even though there were many issues I had with Nat Turner, William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner, it was a better book than James. In my opinion, Styron's Nat Turner is a work of art, and really racist and perverted work of art, but it is an expression of William Styron's worldview, and it's told in really captivating prose that pulls you into his fantasy world, heavy emphasis on fantasy, whether you want to be there or not. James, on the other hand, is so outlandish and frantic, I couldn't really take it seriously, and it just felt like it was being performative, that it was virtue signaling for the audience, but didn't really say anything of substance. So I haven't read Erasure by Percival Everett, but I did watch American Fiction, and I felt like Percival Everett depicted slavery in James like the writer in American Fiction depicted urban life in My Pathology. Oh, and also there was a twist in James, and it really irritated me. And I can't really talk about it without spoiling the book, but I will say that if a story is told in first person, you can't make a twist like there was in James without betraying the reader. And that was just infuriating. And speaking of betraying the reader, that leads me to another book on my list, which is the most irritating book of the year, and that is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. So this book basically broke my trust in every possible way. There's a bunch of twists in the book, and I can't really say what happens without spoiling the book, but after a couple of these twists, I just kept reading out of spite and really hating every minute of it. And I mean, it was written well, but just the author betrayed the reader's trust. And but it is possible that Fingersmith is just not my kind of book, and other people would enjoy it. I'm not a fan of the mystery genre, so people who like really twisty plots might really like it. So if you might want to give it a try, don't let me discourage you. So, and then another thing that really was off-putting to me was it was not very explicit, but it was really unnecessarily explicit, which I don't really need in my books. And then, speaking of explicit content, that will bring me to my next book, which is the most irresponsible book that was published and that I consumed this year, which is The Tell by Amy Griffin. So I had heard about this book from a YouTube channel, and I don't remember which channel it was, and I don't think I would reveal that anyway, because they really connected with the story. From their recommendation, it really sounded like something that I would be interested in. I listened to this on audio, and it was just horrible. For one thing, after I finished the book, I found out that it was ghostwritten for a billionaire, which is one of the main factors in getting it published. Was the supposed author, her story would have sold a lot of books, and that's why the book was published as a memoir, even though the book is based around things that are unverifiable. Through experimental drug treatments, this person recalled I'm not going to say false memories, but she recalled things that supposedly happened to her decades earlier. She had no memory of them before using the drug therapy. So there's no evidence of this except what was in her mind under the influence of drugs, which, if you know anything about drugs, it can cause false memories. So she ended up ruining someone's life and making a bunch of money off of this book, and making the publisher a bunch of money off of this book, which is based on what's nothing more than a dream, basically. So it was just disgusting. And, the way the author behaved in the book, it's not how a victim would behave. Everyone has a different way of handling trauma and, discovering bad things about their past. But just telling everyone, like virtual strangers, about graphic details of supposed abuse that you don't even have any evidence happened except for in a dream state. Anyway, I was really grossed out by this book. So yeah, it was a money-making book, and it should never have been published. Or if they wanted to publish it, they should have published it as a fiction story. So anyway, on to my next book. This is the most motivating book in an infuriating way, and that was Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron. The name Nat Turner was vaguely familiar to me. I knew it had something to do with slavery, and just the title was, appealing, evocative, and the book cover had a bunch of praise on it. It said it won the Pulitzer Prize and everything. So it does say that it's a work of fiction, but the thoughts and actions that William Styron puts into the story of Nat Turner are just so humiliating and just really disgusting. It really pushes the line between what's ethical and not, because if he wanted to write a story about like some perverted religious fanatic, he could have written about a fictional character and not drug the name of Nat Turner through the mud. But again, he used the name recognition of Nat Turner and the slave rebellion as a way to boost his book sales. And I think it's unethical, but the book is written well, even though I don't agree with the narrative that he was telling through his writing. So this book I consider the most influential because after I read it, I was just so mad at how William Styron portrayed Nat Turner in such a horrible light. I had to do research about who Nat Turner was and the conditions of slavery, and then that turned into looking into the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement and even stuff up to today. I was in the middle of that reading project when I found out about all the atrocities that the Trump administration is doing to the people in our country and, internationally. My reading has really fallen off because I've been, I wouldn't say distracted, but deeply affected by everything that I've been finding out. Reading's like on pause for the last couple months. My next book is the most relatable book, which was O Pioneers by Willa Cather. I read this for June on the Range, and the writing style was just really nice. So she personifies the setting and the little houses on the landscape to illustrate the cold and loneliness of the frontier. And I like that kind of stuff. It's not really purple, but it just gets that feeling across. So that is sprinkled throughout the book, but it is a little bit frustrating because that writing style isn't consistently throughout the book, and the tone and the pacing isn't very consistent. But the reason this is on my list is because the story follows a woman who's taking care of her family on the frontier, and I felt like I really could relate to the main character because I'm not living in the harsh pioneer world, but I did a little over a decade ago pick up and move 2 states away with my son to try to build a better life. And there's hardships involved in that endeavor. So I did feel I could relate to the pioneer woman in the story. So the next book is The Most Adorably Brutal, which is Martin the Warrior by Brian Jacques. Throughout the years, whenever I'd go to the thrift store, I'd buy myself books, but I'd also look for books for my son, and I'd pick up books that I think he would like, and sometimes he'd read them, but a lot of times they just get tossed aside and forgotten. This spring, when I was going through my books, I found Martin the Warrior, and there's the cute little mouse on the cover looking ferocious, and I usually read kind of dark and depressing books or nonfiction, so I thought I'd try a lighthearted children's book just to give it a try. And I was definitely I thought it was a children's book, so I was definitely surprised at how much violence and torture and suspense, and there's murder and slavery and these little cute little furry creatures are subjected to. Yeah, it was just really intense, and it was exciting, but I would say that the characters are a little bit one-dimensional. The good guys are really good, and the bad guys are bad for no real reason except they just for the joy of being bad. And then there's things that happen just to cause more drama and move the plot. Oh, and there's some sexism and speciesism as like racism throughout the book, but for a kid's book, it was a fun adventure, and I enjoyed reading it. It was definitely surprising. I never knew about this series or the author, but I guess there's a whole world centered around this, fantasy world of Redwall. If I find another book about these little creatures, I might pick it up, but I don't think I would order them on purpose. My next book is the most inspiring book I've read this year, which is Lift Up Thy Voice by Mark Perry. While I was reading up on slavery, I pulled this book off the shelf, which I found for $1 at the thrift store last year. The book is a nonfiction narrative account of the sisters Sarah and Angelina Grimke and their journeys from being daughters of a slave-holding family and turning away from that culture and becoming prominent abolitionist movement voices. So their message is relevant to the women's movement too. They were included in the women's movement, and because even within the abolitionist movement there were factions where the white people were fighting against the black people for their own movement, and the black people were excluding the women from speaking out for the anti-slavery movement. And it's just, even within the movement there's oppression, which is frustrating, but they definitely help bring a national attention to the abolitionist movement. You know, sparked it was in the 1830s, which was 30 some years before slaves were free, so it was a long journey, and which is pretty disheartening, which when you think about it, because we're still dealing with the same problems to this day, almost 200 years after the Grimke sisters. On to the most, I don't know if this is the right term for it, but I'm just going to say the most ephemeral book, which is Ice by Anna Kavan. So I listened to this book on audio. I was really struck by it when I read it, and it's still one of those books that stands out because of what a bizarre story it is. So I really don't have a lot to say about it because I didn't take notes, and I really should next year, once I start reading again, start taking the time to take notes, because even though feelings can seem so intense right after reading it, it does fade after a while, and you kind of forget what happened in the book. You know, I think taking notes will help retrieve those thoughts. It was definitely a very unique reading experience. It was a dark book, so I can't say I enjoyed it, but definitely moved me. I never heard about this book until I heard Gareth from Book Songs and Other Magic review it, and he really made it sound appealing, and for once I wasn't disappointed by the glowing review. Usually, like James and Fingersmith, I usually am disappointed in highly praised books, but no, Ice was really, really good. It's not a realistic book, so if you like books that are grounded in reality, you probably won't like it. It's kind of a mix between science fiction and magical realism. It's surreal. It's a surreal work of art that really speaks to the darkness and paranoia that lurks behind our consciousness. It's really subtle and quiet, but really powerful. So you might notice, like, if you look at all the fiction books that I like, that they're kind of weird and innovative. They do things that are outside of what can be physically done in our reality, but they still make sense within your mind. Why should a writer be confined to the rules of reality? You know, when you can create anything you want on the page. So that brings me to my next book, which is the most interactive and most ingenious book of the year, which is Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. So while I was reading this book, and for weeks after I finished, I was obsessed. My mind was totally blown. I was taking notes. I was, cross-referencing pages, tabbing, everything, because it just is I can't even explain what an experience this book is. It's, I guess, what you call metafiction. There's like a specific type of metafiction, like, term for this, but Someone said it before, but I can't remember what it is, but it's definitely a different kind of book. I do eventually want to write something about this book and what I feel is going on in the book. I mean, I'll never know whether I'm right or not because sadly Nabokov is no longer around to ask. But it's still really fun to keep thinking about. So if you like your reading to be challenging and you don't mind feeling confused and lost while reading, you would probably like Pale Fire. If you do decide to read it, just don't watch any videos or read any articles on it or anything. I mean, I don't think I said too much so far, but yeah, going blind to this book. Okay, so my next book is The Edges Take on History, which is the history of the Franks, written by Gregory of Tours. So this is another book that I just happened to find. Is Penguin Classic. I'm always drawn to the black spines, and it's the history of the Franks that was written in like the 6th century in like France by the Bishop Gregory of Tours, which was generations and generations before Charlemagne. Well, it starts from the beginning of time and then goes up to Gregory's time, and which focuses on the descendants of Clovis or the Merovingians. So the quote unquote histories are like the retelling of stories that have been passed down throughout the years. It's word of mouth stuff, so there's like a lot of exaggeration and stuff like that. And then when we get to Gregory's time, his world consists of the church, so a lot of his stories revolve around the church and Gregory's activities, and kind of the political and military stuff is happening on the sidelines, or if it's acknowledged at all. But it's just like I wouldn't say quaint, because there's a lot of brutality in this book. There's a lot of blood and guts and gore being flung around by everyone. They weren't afraid to get violent, and Gregory tells it all in pretty full detail and states like the most gruesome story, matter-of-factly, which is jaw-dropping. He's a good writer, and you can tell he's a really compassionate guy, and Gregory's enduring. I like Gregory. And the next book is The Most Harrowing Depiction of Isolation and Degradation, which is The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski. So this book, The Painted Bird, is the book that affected me so much that I had to create this YouTube channel and everything, make up my whole, production, just to talk about The Painted Bird, because it's such a powerful book. Just like in Gregory of Tours, how Gregory of Tours didn't focus on the main political issues of the day. In The Painted Bird, it takes place during World War II and the Holocaust, but it doesn't focus on, the military movements or the horrors of the concentration camps. It focused on the small townspeople. The townspeople weren't innocent anti-Nazi people. They were anti-Semitic. You don't really know why, but it probably had a lot to do with propaganda. But yeah, there was a lot of hatred throughout this book, and it does shed a light on the othering of people by everyday people, which, is happening in the U.S. right now. So, yeah, it was just, it's hard to explain, but it's like the book is fiction and it's set during historical times, but it definitely takes liberty with reality, like in order to make a point of how devastating and how horrific being in that situation was. And the writing is beautiful, it's poetic. It was just another book that really it really affected me. The next book I have on my list is the most mind-melting and most entertaining book, which was Chronic City by Jonathan Lethem. So this is a book that was written, within this century that I like, which is surprising, and by an author that I've never really heard of before. But it's great. Yeah, it's really fun to read, and I'm not really a consistent reader, but the more I read, the more that I'm realizing that I really like science fiction, but not, the really hard sciencey science fiction with aliens and all that. More like alternate reality. What is reality really? Science fiction, which is what this book is. It's really fun. I mean, it's dark. There's darkness in it, which I'm also finding is something that I am drawn to for some reason. It follows like a cast of characters through like a weird alternate Manhattan. I've never been to New York, but I can't imagine it's like the New York in Chronic City. But it's still fun. It kind of reminds me of Kafka's America. So Kafka wrote about America, but had never visited the United States. He just came up with this fantasy world that he said was America, where weird things, weird places were around. The characters kept running into the same people, and everyone knew each other somehow. And that's kind of how Chronic City is, and it's just fun. So I just have to talk about the most standout scene in the book, which is where all these maniacal characters are in the apartment and they get caught up in a bidding war on eBay, and it's just like a frenzy of like desperation and aggression and competition and addiction, and it just expresses that, I don't know how to explain it, but that compulsion and that like never wanting to stop feeling when you get caught up in something, which that was fun. There were things that didn't really connect in the story, which, if one thing was one way, then this other part couldn't really make sense. But it's still fun, regardless of its flaws. There's plot holes, and rationality is thrown out the window, but still, it's a good book. I do have another Jonathan Lethem book on my shelf. I listened to this on audio, which was fun. And I have Fortress of Solitude in hardback on my shelf. And I listened to his short story collection, Eye of the Wall or something like that. And then I also listened to Motherless Brooklyn. But Chronic City was the best. You ever notice that like the first book you discover or read or listen to from an author is like becomes your favorite book? I don't know if that's like an imprinting thing or... So we finally made it to the best book of the year, which is also the most inspiring book of the year. But wait, I already said that there was an inspiring book, but this is more inspiring than Lift Up Thy Voice, and it's the most tragic book of the year and the most relevant book in today's climate, which is, now I'm going to ask a question which I asked myself when I finished listening to this book, and I'm going to see if you can guess what the book is. Who taught you to fear this amazing, determined voice of hope? I don't know. I can't I can't deliver with as much, umph as he does. Who taught you to fear this amazing, determined voice of hope? Who is that? The Autobiography of Malcolm X, which was told to Alex Haley. After I finished listening to this book, I wanted to make a video about it and quickly realized that it was the best book that I experienced this year. Decided to make this video instead, just to go over all the good books and not so good books of the year. So I do want to do a video about the Autobiography of Malcolm X, but I would want to reread the book in print. I have it on my shelf, and I want to tab and make notes, and so I can really go through every thought I have on this amazing inspiration of a man. After I listened to this book and listened to some speeches by Malcolm X, I was very, very angry that I had not. I mean, I'm pretty close to 50, and I've waited this long to get acquainted with Malcolm X, and I'm so mad at myself, but I'm also mad at all the history books and all the media and all the voices that said, oh, Malcolm X was a dangerous and violent and racist and radical. After hearing all that, I was afraid of him. I totally bought into the Martin Luther King Jr. non-violent resistance, and like an ignorant fool, I believed all that negative propaganda and stayed away, far, far away from Malcolm X. And I wish I hadn't. His autobiography is the most beautiful story of redemption I've ever heard. And just when he was about to make some big moves and get over his hang-ups and get past his own prejudices, he was assassinated at age 39. At age 39, his life was ended. He could have done so much with another 20 or 30. Who knows how long he could have lived if he wasn't assassinated. He could have done so much. He could have brought so many people together, and it's just heartbreaking to think about. And speaking of heartbreaking, once I started looking into Malcolm X, I came across Fred Hampton, which I had never heard of. He was just starting out as a leader of the Black Panthers, and of course the Black Panthers were demonized just like Malcolm X was. And Fred Hampton, at the ridiculously young age of 21, was murdered in his bed in the middle of the night by the Chicago police with the intelligence of the FBI and probably the CIA. He was only 21. And my son is 22. So that really puts things into perspective, and I just can't imagine. I mean, his life was hardly getting started, and he was murdered. Fred Hampton and Malcolm X were targeted because they were fighting against, well, Malcolm X's story is more complicated. He was involved in a cult which once he moved away from that cult, they thought he was a threat. So the leader of the cult made the call to eliminate him. And it's hard to believe that the U.S. government didn't know about this assassination plot because they were surveilling Malcolm X. So they had the power to prevent that assassination from happening, but it was convenient for them for him to be gone. So that's what happened. Anyway, they devoted their lives and lost their lives to try to better the lives of others. And they're gone, but the problems aren't. Today, they're just a select few of very rich and powerful people that are sowing seeds of discontent amongst us underlings, because it is more beneficial to them for us to be fighting with each other instead of fighting the real problem, which is that our government is bought and sold by big corporations that disregard human rights to pursue ungodly profits. So, yeah, really, I'm riled up, and I'm sorry to leave this video on such a negative note. Here's to a better 2026. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, and also if you have any suggestions for me, reading suggestions, because I do have a lot of unread books on my shelves, but I am open to good suggestions, especially if they are books that venture outside of the normal plot-driven and linear narrative. So yeah, leave your suggestions below, and have a happy holiday, as happy as you can have under this current situation in the United States or wherever you are. And I might put out another video before the end of the year, but if I don't, have a happy new year, and I'll see you in the next video.